Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. I'm once again joined by Florian. Glad to have you back, Florian.
Glad to be here.
All right, this is episode 116 of the Casual Stream. Again, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Telegram and Twitter and support me on Facebook. Subscribe to our locals and buy me a coffee. Today's episode is a little bit more accessible than abstract biological theories. Arthur C. Clarke's Three Laws. Arthur C. Clarke is, of course, a famous science fiction author known for his short stories, as well as the 2001 Space Odyssey series. I think it's 2 or 3 books. And then Childhood's End. But he's also famous for what we're going to talk about tonight, his 3 laws. Now, his 3 laws are as such. Law number 1, when a distinguished but utterly scientist states that something is possible, he is almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he is very probably wrong. 2, the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. 3, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Now, the first articulation of these 3 laws was found in a book he wrote and published in 1962 called The Hazards of Prophecy, and they are articulated in the second chapter, The Failure of Imagination. Now, what's interesting here is that he's a science fiction author, but he's also a, quote, science popularizer. And, I'll just say they were built different back then. Reading the chapter for today from his 1962 book, you couldn't imagine, someone today writing a book like that about science and how it develops over time and relates to the society around us. But for my own personal, I've known about these 3 laws since I discovered science fiction, 20-some years ago. And the one that I got the most mileage out of was any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So we'll start with this, Florian. When were you first exposed to Clarke's 3 laws?
I think I had them floating around in the blog posts and I read and the internet sources I had, maybe some movies somewhere. I never read them in one go, and so I wasn't really directly aware of them until you reminded me of them. But they are they were intuitively right to me, and I wasn't surprised by listening to them. As a scientist myself, I can especially identify with the first law. I'm probably an elderly scientist myself, where everything beyond the age of 35 is probably elderly in this context.
Well, actually, Clarke says so. In the Chickson we read, he said 30 plus is old.
Well, yeah, 30 plus. That's why I said 35. Give me 5 years. But yeah.
So the interesting thing here is, if we go to the chapter from the book, the chapter is called it's Hazards of Prophecy. The chapter is The Failure of Imagination. Now, the first law is specifically invoked when he's talking about some scientist who said that we were never going to fly. Oh, no, here, Lord Rutherford, yeah. And he's talking about him making some really bad prediction. And
yeah, Lord Rutherford. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, Lord Rutherford said that we'll never be able to harness nuclear energy. Lord Rutherford, if I'm correct, maybe it was a different Rutherford, but he had experiments that basically showed that if you bombard a gold plate with electrons, that most of the electrons make it through the plate, which then led people for the largely correct presumption at the time that atoms have a small nucleus and then basically a lot of space, and then the electrons that go around the nucleus. And because there's so much space between the atoms and between nucleus and electrons, that's why electrons can just whiz right through the atom. Because back then some people thought whole atoms are like strawberries, right? It's like a positive core, and there's like the electrons are glued on top of it. And Rutherford showed that it's not like that. It's like a small core, and then the electrons in some distance around it. But and the difference would be if this was the nucleus of an atom, positively charged nucleus, then the electrons would be, you would able to find the electrons upstate New York, basically. That's sort of the space you would have between. And so he thought then it's kind of logic that you would then assume, the nucleus is something so small there, it's impossible to glean any energy from it, right? So that's an example of how you come up with a model and then you basically have a failure of imagination, or you have basically self-imposed limit, right? It's also, I think you also talked about Auguste Comte, that he asserted that astronomy could never reveal stellar chemistry, which is not true. We invented the spectroscope, and now we can, right? So that's one aspect of failure of imagination.
Yeah, yeah. His second law, to venture to the only way of discovering the limit of the possible is to venture a little way past the limit of the impossible,
Yeah.
is the result of his discussion about the revolution in science that began around 1900. He says, let's imagine, we could have Benjamin Franklin, Galileo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Archimedes, and I'll show them a car or some sort of mechanical device. And he's going to argue that, well, they all understand mechanics. It might take them a little while to understand industry and other things, but they'd eventually figure it out. And then he says, but what would be very difficult for them to figure out are the things that are more abstract and not visible. He says, and I quote, whatever his degree of education or intelligence, he would not possess the mental framework that would accommodate electron beams, transistors, atomic fission, waveguides, and cathode ray tubes. Now, just as a quick aside here, I argue that Clarke is being having a lack of imagination here, because all the sort of like scientific stuff that we can measure that we don't see directly, but we either see indirectly by observing the effect that it has, or by using some instrument to observe something, both of which are indirect observations. That kind of thing already existed. That was called alchemy. That was called Hermeticism. And Newton himself did both. Newton did astronomy, like we would consider it today the science, but also he would do, astrology and alchemy. So I think they would be able, granted, I'm not saying it'd be easy. Not like it'd be easy for them to understand a modern car either, but that's just an aside. The point that Clarke is getting at is that if you limited yourself just to what it could be conceived or seen, you then wouldn't push beyond into something else. He mentions a good example with the early computer by Charles Babbage. He said, well, the idea was sound, but industry hadn't caught up to be able to make the component parts for his machine. And sort of Babbage is his flagship character for the second law. Is there anything you want to add here, Florian?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Also, and I think you alluded to that a little bit. Everything, classical electromechanic, right? That is always, and to this day, that gets taught via mechanical principles in physics books. Basically, you learn mechanics first, like how a particle is moving, and then how levers work, and everything that can be explained by mechanics. And then you use the same framework to also explain electromagnetic properties, which is a little bit more funky, but it's still easy to explain that with mechanical models, basically, right? You say, okay, the electrodynamic equations, we can see they are a little similar to the mechanical equations if we change some parameter here, and look how beautiful physics is all working into one unified theme together, right? But you could also see that as something that an attempt in trying to reel the unexplainable back into the realm of explainability, right? Because electricity, electromagnetism is something that we cannot observe. The movement of a lever we can observe, right? And in a way, that is also we're trying to not go beyond that which we understand. That's why quantum mechanics was so important, because now all of a sudden physics was treading on a surface that couldn't be explained by classical by classical mechanics, right? So that needed to be an imagination going beyond the boundaries beyond the existing boundaries, and it's still kind of difficult to explain if you really dig deep. You have to see it from an entirely different angle. But if you look at it at quantum mechanics from a spiritual angle, then you could also say that it's an attempt by humans to put it back into areas that they can explain. So the second law of Clarke is actually still alive, and we always we venture into the unknown a little bit, but we always try to pull it back into the realm we can understand.
Right. And the last law that he mentions, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. He already leads up to this with two things, and they both deal with this pivot from the observable classical mechanics of Newton to the quantum revolution in the early 20th century where we can't observe it. He says that the earlier scientists who would have said that atomic fission was impossible, and I quote, he says, no matter how far-sighted and imaginative he might be, your pre-20th century scientists would have said would utter nonsense. That's magic, not science. Such things can't happen in the real world. And then he also says that even, Benjamin Franklin, Galileo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Archimedes might understand the mechanics of a car, but he's like the workmanship, he says, and I quote, which would have seemed magical in its precision. So they would have been astonished by that. So what he's saying is that the shift to the magic part of that is that you have a science now you don't observe directly. You observe these things indirectly. And once you have the tools to observe them and the mental space to account for such things, then you move into the realm of something that's more quantified and scientific. And so it's interesting here when he pits science against magic, or not pits science against magic, but when he says it's indistinguishable from magic, magic seems to be, in this context, referring to phenomena that exists that we do not yet understand and look to. The minute we can capture it and understand it and describe it, it ceases to be magic. That seems to be what magic means in this context. Would you agree, Florian?
Yeah, we try to, it's still magic to us, but we try to explain it, try to make it less magical by explaining it with conventional rules, right? That's always what we try. We may venture beyond the limit of what we know, but what we find outside the limit, we try to pull back into the limit so that we can explain it. We demystify we demystify it instead of embracing the mystics of it. Some people do, right? But science tries to demystify things because otherwise it couldn't understand the phenomena it is exploring.
Yeah. So those are some of the where these ideas jump, because they kind of sound plausible and sensible if you just hear them, in some internet chat or some talking head on TV, right? But they are derived out of a specific context, and the context is Clarke writing about the history of science and the importance of imagination. So that's the sort of the background for where this is coming from, which I think is important. Now, the other thing is there's been spin-offs, and the wiki page has spin-offs, but most of them are quite bad. What I like about Clarke's three laws is they're very precise in what he's trying to say, right? They're not these sort of like wide, sweeping statements that lack nuance that, you might have to walk back later on because you said too much, right? These are, especially the first law, it's very precise. When a distinguished but elderly scientist states something is possible, he's almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he's very probably wrong. Now, you mentioned this privately before, but there's Asimov's reworking of this, which is really bad. When, however, the lay public rallies around an idea that is denounced by distinguished but elderly scientists and supports that idea with great fervor and emotion, the distinguished but elderly scientists are then, after all, probably right. And I'm like, well, okay, COVID, transgenderism. Sorry, Asimov, That did not age well at all. And you see, here's the thing, right? Before you go, Florian, Clarke is making a measured statement. Asimov is patting himself on the back, trying to just have this sort of like class prejudice. We're scientists. We don't make mistakes.
Yeah, class prejudice is exact word, or like some other people might say, the revenge of the nerd for being shoved too often into the locker. And it's always there's always like some kind of disdain for especially by scientists for non-scientists. Oh, the unwashed masses, they can't possibly understand what I'm doing. Well, maybe they can, or maybe your science, maybe what you do in science is not really that interesting for everyone else. But you kind of say like we are the special anointed people, and I find that very annoying because sometimes people give away their humanity there. Like look at some smart person. If he has a grudge, if he has a chip on his shoulder, these people will happily make fun of people that are not as smart as them, and I find that really disgusting. But you see that, so they're not the better people, and in a way, as you just said, COVID, transgenderism, and all that are things where you shouldn't trust scientists, and sometimes they start running away with statements of the actually variety, which are also very annoying, and they think themselves very smart, but they really are not. They're very not. They're just going into sophistry because that's an area they know very well, and they're very very versed in it, and nobody else can really understand them. That's why some of those people go into sophistry escapades that are of no value to anyone. And what Asimov did with his statement is actually really muddying the waters there, because, as you said, Clarke had like a beautiful, well-defined statement, and Asimov, for whatever reason, couldn't just let it stand like that.
Well, you
It's
know what
funny, maybe.
it could have also been professional rivalry. If
Yeah,
'cause they're both writing science fiction novels, right? They're both science popularizers. So it's possible that Asimov acted thoughtlessly, reflexively, trying to just, oh, I'm not going to let Clarke, corner the
yeah.
market on this, right? That could be. We do have a question from Seamus O'Blaine. So, what we have pragmatic operational control without full theoretical models of? Yeah, that's sort of where we're at now. We don't have a full theoretical model of all these things, but we have a level of operational control. That would be the sort of like quantum revolution that Clarke was talking about in the
Yeah. And it's true with AI too, right? AI is, and as Elon Musk said it today. I saw a tweet where he said that Grok 4 is able to come up with solutions that that you can't find in any textbook. And I think that's something in that direction. Maybe that was like advertisement, maybe that was bragging a little bit, but I think AI is already in that direction, and we are able to use AI's outcome without really understanding what happened below the lid. Um, we had that already for a while. If you remember, there were time when they were all over the internet, like AI designing an airplane wing, or like wing for an aircraft, and that wing looked like completely crazy and bonkers from the inside or outside. It had some weird shape. It looked like something from a David Lynch movie rather than an functioning airplane wing. But apparently, that is how AI imagines an airplane wing, and it works. And you don't understand how that works, but the computer made it for you. Now, that could just be trial and error and not really a cogent scientific base. But who is to say there is a base we just don't understand it, right? So that would be another example. We have pragmatic operational control, hopefully, without full theoretical models of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's see. With the rule number 3, though, the one that I like, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The other thing that's interesting is if you look that, and part of this is what a lot of people tend to forget in the history of science. This all did develop out of magic. Astronomy developed out of astrology. Chemistry developed out of alchemy. That is now derisively called magic today, and sort of, but Newton did both, and he's considered the father of modern physics because there wasn't such a sharp distinction back then, right? And so partly what does make those things, astrology and alchemy, quote, magic, but astronomy and chemistry, quote, science. And part of it is there is a level of abstraction here that people don't follow. So, for example, in fantasy, wizards have grimoires, which are books full of lore and spells. I mean, how is that really different than a user manual for like an advanced computing system? How many people can actually understand that user manual? Very few people, right? But once you understand it, and then you can then control the inputs and the outputs of the computer, well, all of a sudden, you know how to make it work. And it looks a lot like magic to anybody else who can't see what's going on behind the scenes. Yeah. And then furthermore, with the idea of predicting eclipses. See, in the past, the only people that had enough education and leisure were the priests, who even Aristotle says the Egyptian priests were the first philosophers. So they could study the stars and then predict eclipses. And then they would then claim that they or their god were responsible for the eclipse. And that would look like a real show of power to the people that didn't know any better. I'm pretty sure Tecumseh's brother, the great Indian chief who rose up in the early 19th century in the American Midwest, his brother predicted an eclipse. And that then was used as evidence that the Great Spirit favored them because he predicted, the Great Spirit listened to him and blotted out the sun, right? Now, that's magic, right? The Native Americans who are swayed by this are swayed by a kind of primitive animistic magic. But what's Tecumseh's brother using? Just astronomy, just science to predict where, the sun is going to be, the moon is going to be rather. And then, but think about it today too, with like modern day scientists, who talk about the miracles of science, do what we say, trust the science. How is this not a new priest caste like we had in the Middle Ages or in, ancient Greece or Egypt, right? Where they just trust us. We have all the arcane knowledge. It's almost like it comes full circle, like an Ouroboros,
I mean, it's also probably a good explanation if you think about it for why they were very much against why they call people science deniers and stuff like that, anti-vaxxers and all these slurs, right? If you call someone a denier, of course, where do we know that word from? From Holocaust denial, right? So if you call anything denial, that's a very subtle and very nasty way to smear a person for any opinion he holds. And so when they say anti-vaxxers or science deniers, they're probably afraid of people. They are people going there and maybe they figure out maybe what they find is true. Maybe even if it's not true what science deniers find, they would go ahead and then maybe try out more explanation. All of a sudden, eventually, they'll get behind the secret of those magicians, those scientists, right? And then everyone knows their secret, and then they lose their power. I think that's also a thought behind it, right? Because if you really go, like, just for the example, vaccine, like those are not people that are against vaccination, but if you look at childhood vaccination schedule, it's just completely crazy. And you jab a child 5 times per year with 20 different vaccinations. No other country in the world does that, right? And so there's real concern about that. I think it can't be good if you jam a needle into a baby's arm like once a week as a routine measure. Or it's at least something we should talk about. But if everyone starts picking it up, then all of a sudden these people also lose their power a little bit, right? Because they can't claim they have magic over people, and they can't claim they can't use that power over people, And even especially after COVID, now somebody who wears a lab coat and goes on TV is just not believable anymore. Like before COVID, it was, but they overdid it, and so that has all gone down the drain. That image and the scientist brand. And that's what they're upset about. They're upset about losing their power because people start doubting that it's magic, they find very normal explanations, and they also find explanations. They find the language of the grimoire. The same reason that the Catholic Church didn't want to have people engaging in the the automatic book press when it was invented by I forgot the name. Who invented the book press?
Gutenberg.
Gutenberg, exactly. Gutenberg wasn't on good terms with the clergy back then, right? They didn't want that. They didn't want people printing the Bible. So it's basically it reduces the barrier for entry. And if you have a good position based on that barrier of entry, of course you don't want that. And that's behind scientists don't want to give up their power.
Yeah. Now, one of the good spin-offs, I think, from the three laws is a contrapositive of the third law. And a contrapositive is where the premise and the hypothesis are negated, called Gem's corollary. Any technology distinguishable from magic is insufficiently advanced. I'm like, well, that actually would follow from flipping the truth values of the P and Q for premise 3 for law 3. And I think that's kind of interesting because it's like going back to the original distinction between classical mechanics and quantum mechanics that Clarke is getting at. The fact that, say, somebody in the 19th century would have considered technologies that are the result of quantum mechanics magic, does sort of indicate that there is this creep. And now that we've sort of attempted to close that distance, it no longer seems like magic anymore, which means I guess it's not as advanced. I mean, well, it's the magic has been pushed back, right? It's been pushed back into something even more complex, even more difficult to comprehend, right? And so from that new vantage point, what we have is insufficiently advanced to distinguish it, because we've closed that distance. Because ultimately, the thing about it, what does physics try to do? It tries to reduce everything to simple axioms. Or the ultimate goal of physics is to simplify things. Even though it is complex in a theoretical sense, when you're all done, you want it to be simple.
Yeah, you want to understand it. It's basically a way to make people understand physics. But I think but I think some of the understanding is given away by physics voluntarily. For example, if you have to understand phenomena, it's physics will try to understand a complex electrical circuit by the movement of electrons. But if you have a really complex circuit like in a computer, that doesn't quite work anymore, and you just simplify it more and more. But in the end, you have to resort to mathematics, and then that's not something you can understand anymore. But you can say, okay, we understand the phenomenon in 3 dimensions. Really, the phenomenon has unlimited dimensions, but we don't understand that. But we can understand 3 dimensions, and we just trust the mathematics that it does the rest. I don't think, I won't talk out of turn here, but I didn't or talk beyond my capabilities here. I haven't looked much into string theory, but I'm venturing a guess that scientists don't understand really how many dimensions do they have? 28, 29 dimensions. It's impossible to understand, right? There's only math that can get you through it, and there's where you basically lose the usefulness of physics. You use it still to use mathematics to calculate the phenomena, but I doubt you can really use it to understand a complex thing like string theory. I mean, maybe it's not enough. Maybe not everything can be distilled down to a few interactions.
Yeah. The other thing I think that follows from the third law is that I don't know if Clarke was actually trying to say this or not, but if it would seem to be the case that sorcerers, magicians from the past were just advanced scientists. The people couldn't figure out what kind of science they were doing, right? Because it's so advanced, they all thought it was magic, right? Now, I guess Clarke would say those people were just charlatans. But then again, we go back to Newton, right? Newton is an alchemist, okay? He studies alchemy, but then that helps create chemistry. And also he creates, modern mechanical physics. So the question, they come out of each other. That's the thing, right? Historically, they come out of this. So I think now whether the scientists of Clarke's day or our day want to admit this is a whole nother question. But I think what follows is that maybe not all of these men, but a lot of these men in the past that would have been considered magicians or sorcerers were pursuing a kind of advanced science that people didn't know what to call.
Well, but then what was Seamus' correlation? The other one, to the other direction. I think that's. I mean, yeah, every science sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. Yeah. But there are also a lot of charlatans that are not advanced scientists, practicing magic, right? So not every advanced scientist is a magician, but not every magician is a scientist. I think that's the way you could look at it.
Well, yeah, that would just be like pseudoscience today, right? Those false practitioners.
Yeah, but even there, many things are called pseudoscience that are just maybe just somebody was wrong, and then they do more experiments or do more studies and realize their error and then correct it. I think the real charlatans are just the ones that do it for either attention or they do it like the classical snake oil salesman to just make a quick buck, right? Those charlatans, of course, also exist, but not every magician that struggles to explain or not every magician that is wrong necessarily means is a charlatan.
Well, it's just trial and error, just like with Edison and the light bulb, right?
There's a intellectually honest attempt to make things right. It's not like we're not using like little pearls to show people and then they buy it even though they're completely worthless.
Yeah. And so that I think is interesting here, but the other thing is too, let's go back to the first law, right? Because from the 40s, 50s, 60s, even right down to today, of course, scientists have a massive ego because they view themselves as the new priest class of our age. And I'm again still struck by the careful wording of the first law. It's carefully worded, right? He's saying that older scientists can sometimes, not be all there. He's trying to be polite, right? Not trying to, insult them. And he's also saying that they are scientists, right? Even if they are in their quote old age and can make mistakes, they're still scientists. And the way he says that, they can still be right even once they start to, get off their game, is in a very narrow sense, right? It's not this like optimistic, triumphalist, scientists can never be wrong. It's more like, and notice too the difference. There's a key difference between Clarke's construction and Asimov's. Asimov is classist. He's pitting the scientist against the people. Yeah. What Clarke is doing is pitting the scientist against himself. He says it's still the same person, the same subject in each part of the construction, right? Whereas Asimov has to add in this other class of people called the rest of us and then try to make us look stupid. Which is like, well, that's not the spirit of Clarke's law. The spirit here is that there is one man who can be wrong and can be right. And here are the conditions under which he's likely to be right. And here are the conditions under which he's likely to be wrong. In which case, again, that's a very carefully worded statement. I like that because it shows that Clarke was thinking very hard about this.
Yeah, good point with the class consciousness of Asimov. Maybe he skewed more socialist communist in his mindset, and that maybe then class has been on his mind. But it's also, and it's something that Keith mentions sometimes, that communist regimes are basically reminiscent of monarchies of old. And there also were classes, right? So it's basically what we call in Germany Dünkel, which is basically having a high nose. You deem yourself more worthy than others, right? Instead of seeing it as just a social stratification of society, you believe that your own shit don't stink, and you think your class is better than anyone else. And I think that's the fatal error that many scientists do. And I think that's something everyone should be able to get above. I mean, especially in the beginning, like when you set out on a career as a scientist, you think you can it's acquiring the keys to understand the world, and that feels pretty powerful. But then over time, you know that you realize that there's also many failures, and you're just human after all. And I think that's something everyone should, especially scientists, should adhere to. But it's a little bit difficult if you are in an ivory tower and basically just talk amongst yourselves, like a monk or priest class, really isolated from the rest of society. And maybe the worst Mayan, Incas, Aztecs, who practiced the ritual where they would carve the heart out of their conquered tribes.
Well, the Aztecs are famous for that, but the Maya did that to some degree too. But the Aztecs are probably what you're thinking of.
An act like that is gruesome, but maybe it wasn't even gruesome for the priest class back then. Maybe they thought, well, that's very normal, where everyone else was afraid of that, but they thought, hey, that's normal. They didn't even see themselves as monsters, right? I don't
Yeah.
want to. I don't want to say scientists would be psychopaths that carve the heart out of other people. Of course not. If you're an isolated class, if you're an isolated group of people, then you can develop a sense of self-importance that is not in congruence with reality.
Yes. There's a list of variants of the third law at the end of the wiki page. They're kind of bad, but I'll look at a couple of them. This one is just so bad. What's called Shermer's law. Any sufficiently advanced extraterrestrial intelligence is indistinguishable from God. Now, why this is interesting, despite being awful, is that it just shows that atheists never understood what the name God denoted, right? God in the Christian conception of the world, because of course Shermer is dealing with the Abrahamic faith, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. God is the thing that doesn't get created, right? He's the being that exists necessarily. So there's literally no reason why anybody would say this unless you just really didn't understand what God is supposed to be signified by that word. So this is a useful to point to show that atheists never really understood what God was. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, the atheists, and I think that's what Owen Benjamin said in the video I recently saw. I shared it. That basically he had a video on Twitter where he said that people basically they deny the existence of God by falling into their own orderly structure. Well, that is something they don't question, right? So basically, they elevate the order they prefer over God, which they can't explain. They prefer the order over anything else. So that is going to be their God, right? So that's their God. Um, Something like that's basically what they are afraid of. I'm poorly paraphrasing here, but that's basically what they're obedient to, their own order, right? Their own system. That's something they don't question at all. And so saying that that extraterrestrial intelligence would be indistinguishable to God is basically an example of how they try to put the notion of God back into a more expanded construct of reality it's an easy expansion of their own construct. There's rules, and then there's probably extraterrestrial life, and when they come here, we would see that they would be God, and then that's basically trying to put everything back into the structure that they religiously adhere to.
So what you're saying, Florian, is they have a lack of imagination, a failure of imagination. Like that. What's funny because that's the entire point that Clarke is railing against. Clarke is warning us with these laws not to fall into the pitfall of a lack of imagination. And yet, a lot of these spin-off laws are a complete lack of imagination. They didn't get what Clarke was trying to get at, right? Asimov, total lack of imagination. And I know he has it because I've read The Foundation. I mean, he has imagination, just not there. Shermer just doesn't have any imagination. So it's funny, right? They try to rework these laws, so they miss the entire point of why Clarke gave them.
Yeah, and you can see it from many points of view. In a way, I believe it's a rebellion against God. It's a consistent rebellion against that I mean, why do you have to replace it with your own God? Why do you have to replace it with your own rules? It's basically not saying the atheists will tell you there's no God because we can explain everything with scientific principles. Yeah, well, okay, man. There's no Bible God because there's already the science God. And then they say, no, but we can show this. We can do experiment and we can show this. But at one point, you need certain set of rules and axioms in which you believe. Period. And you don't doubt that you can figure out what you want to find out via science. That's religious. I mean, I'm sorry. That's just I don't see any other explanation for that because they are so convinced they never even start to doubt it. Atheists will never doubt their scientific explanation of reality at all, especially not as much as they doubt God. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah,
So we have another. This one I think is for you. Enlightened despot. Scientists seem quite capable of cutting out people's hearts if the correct forms are filed in.
yeah.
That's actually pretty funny.
The Aztec priests would say, "Oh man, those new priests are so lame. We didn't need any form back in my time." But yeah, yeah, it's true. They have no problem. They have no problem doing that. It's a very good point.
Okay, we have a super chat from Love Gun for $4.99 US. Thank you. For my brother Mona, he truly loved your channel and what you stand for. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let's see here. See, and this is why I think actually, even though we haven't talked much about it, law number 2 is sort of the tie-in to his chapter, The Failure of Imagination. Because what is law 2? It's about having imagination. Because why would you want to push past the limits of the possible? Unless you had imagination, right? That's why you would want to do that. And so we can see the second law as sort of being, it's almost like a sandwich, where like the first and the third laws kind of follow from the second, because the entire mental exercise here is to have an imagination, because this is found in a chapter called The Failure of Imagination. And what's kind of funny, if this was a test to gauge people's imagination, most scientists and most atheists who regurgitate and rework his laws fail badly.
Yeah. Which laws?
Well, all of them, but specifically the second law, which is like, why would you keep pushing unless you had an imagination?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. But nobody really stays outside, right? They push outside the limits, but then they go back inside the limits. I find it really fascinating because nobody stays outside the limits. I mean, some people do probably, but it's very lonely out there, and you don't have any comforting infrastructure to fall back on, neither spiritual nor moral nor physical or nor like any philosophy behind it. It's just completely new land, right? And so maybe some people do. I don't know, but yes, you do need to push beyond the limits of reality, and maybe staying there a little bit longer may reveal even more. You push a little bit beyond it, and then you can see what your own mindset really constitutes, or what your own reality really constitutes. But maybe you have to let your imagination run wild a little bit longer.
Well, you brought up a really interesting point here, Florian. You said if you be outside of the limits too long, it gets lonely and there's no comforting structure to fall back on. What was the new atheist critique of religion? It was a comforting crutch or belief structure to fall back on. Now, think about how many people have been criticizing scientists for having lifestyles or political positions or public statements that are not actually what the science would indicate is true. What that shows me is that the scientific sort of like culture that they are in serves for them the same way that they criticize people who have religion. They go back to that because that's comforting. It makes them feel good. They feel secure in the same way that they criticize religious people for their faith, Because if they were truly scientists, there's a lot of things they wouldn't have said or done because the science wasn't there for it, right? But they did anyhow because they were afraid of leaving that safe space, if you will, right? And so I actually think you hit on an interesting point there.
I think, and the safe space gives you a construct that you don't need to think on your own anymore, right? It's like I'm reminded of that Bob Dylan line from is it Positively 4th Street or another song? It's on Blonde on Blonde, that album. Um, and if you want to live outside the law, you must be honest. And the same here. If you want to live outside the boundaries of your system, then you need to be self-reliant on that, right? So basically, there's no law that does it for you. You need to come up with everything yourself, which is also very interesting. So only the really self-sufficient people can ever go beyond beyond the boundaries of reality. The second of Clarke's law, will work best, maybe only for those that are self-sufficient enough to be able to go beyond the boundaries.
Yeah, kind of like Mendel, right? The monk in a cloister, right? He's already outside of society. There's no reason to push him back in. So Mendel is comfortable enough to go step outside and speculate about biology.
Yeah.
Right?
You mean the monk Mendel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing too in that section about imagination, he quotes Roger Bacon about the flying machines and and automated chariots in which he couldn't think in terms of a car, right? So, but yeah, that's really interesting that somebody from the 13th century could envision. Let me read it. Instruments may be made by which the largest ships with only one man guiding them will be carried with greater velocity than if they were full of sailors. Chariots may be constructed that will move with incredible rapidity without the help of animals. Instruments of flying may be formed in which a man sitting at his ease and meditating on any subject may beat the air with his artificial wings after the manner of birds, as also machines which will enable men to walk at the bottom of the seas. Clarke says, this passage is a triumph of imagination over hard fact. Everything in it has come true, yet at the time it was written, it was more an act of faith than of logic. That's an interesting way to word it, right? Because how often today we have scientists attack faith? But what Clarke is saying is without faith of a certain kind, you couldn't have modern science. Because Roger Bacon had to have faith that these discoveries could be done at some point, even though he had no idea how it could happen.
I mean, there's really no way to imagine a boat that is directed by just one person, because back then boat meant a ship with sailors in it. There need to be sailors in a boat. Otherwise, how can that be a boat if nobody's sitting in there, right? So you have to imagine things like a boat that looks different of your previous concept of a boat, and so that is something you need to have faith on. And sometimes you're not even able to put your thoughts into an actual picture. You will just know that there's something out there that doesn't conform to your current understanding of reality, but something is out there, and you just have to take it on faith to go further and to explore it more. But you can't explore it with your rule set, your guide set that you have anyway. I mean, someone who envisions ships as filled with sailors, there's very little possibility for him to really use the tools that he has at hand to envision a ship that's different from a ship filled with sailors. So just stay with that example. You have to really think well beyond what you know from reality, and you need to basically come up with something that is completely new that nobody has thought about, which somebody like Jules Verne, for example, did. But it was just vastly before the time Jules Verne imagined all that, but it was pure imagination. You cannot deduct this from the existing rule set that you have. You cannot deduct submarine that's 20,000 leagues beyond the sea, based on your current state of tools that you have available. In many cases, you cannot imagine traveling to the inside of the world without. I mean, you cannot imagine with the tools you have at hand. And Verne still tried that somehow. So his imagination was still tinged with the flavor of the existing tools at his time, right? So we imagined he would like travel down, and then there would be a firmament and things at the firmament, and things like that. But he still tried to imagine something that nobody was able to do at the time. But and I would say Jules Verne wasn't just right because of positive bias. We look back now. Jules Verne was famous for his writing even before these things materialized, right? So that's very fascinating. That maybe he was tapping into something, or maybe all the visionaries are tapping into something that people deep down feel could be there, but they can't articulate it.
Yes, exactly. And this is something Clarke says, which is very, very important. The real future is not logically foreseeable.
Yeah.
Now, this is huge, right? Because, and he's using Roger Bacon's, prophetic statement for this. But what have we heard our entire lives from the quote scientific community, science fiction community, and science popularizer community? One, they pretend to be logical. That's another question. I don't think they are, but that's another question. They have no imagination. They're the most boring, dull people you'll ever meet. What? And it's funny, right? A lot of people who became scientists, like the ones we're dealing with today, did so because they read Clarke and Asimov, who were filled with magic and imagination and charm, and then they just had it all squeezed out of them. And it's just kind of bizarre that this is the end result of this kind of effervescence in the 40s and 50s and 60s.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, the problem is if you have science as a if you have science as a profession, it becomes a problem because now you have to do it to make money. And so, of course, now whoever pays for the orchestra decides for the music. So whoever pays scientists will scientists will self censor. Scientists will self select to say things that are palatable to a grand submission committee. This is just normal behavior, right? Now you need to make money with it, so you need to formulate things that are still palatable to the people that pay you, or you have to go on side quests that are fascinating but not really threatening to those people that pay you. And so the people that the only scientists that can be truly be independent are either extremely strong-minded and they're powerful enough that maybe they already have a senior position, they are tenured, they can't really be kicked off, or maybe it's too cumbersome to kick them off, and so now they can come up with some more interesting ideas, or they are independently wealthy and can just they can just bankroll their own institute and they do the research they like. But even then, they don't want to be someone who is. They still do want to be invited on those parties, right? So I think that was not a scientist, but Alan Dershowitz was lamenting in 2018 that his support for Trump has made it impossible for him to be invited to any Long Island party or any New York party any upscale New York party. They didn't want to have him anymore, and even the wealthiest scientists will still want to be part of the science community, right? If they kick you out and they see you as a persona non grata, it's a lonely existence, and especially in science, we need to collaborate with others. So herein lies the problem. And of course, some scientists are just completely boring people. Yeah, it also selects for people that are in a very, very dry, very boring, very meticulous type A personality. But there are people who lost a little bit of their imagination, and that's a sad thing. But this is what happens when you institutionalize an area of society. It becomes very much standard, going to a certain, and it will go after certain conventional concept. And you have to be trustworthy. You have to trust enough in that there will always be people that are willing to buck the consensus, but it's hard. It's difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we've covered this sufficiently. I'll just wrap it up and say that the message behind the 3 laws, what Clarke is trying to do, is he's trying to show you that you need to have imagination. Imagination is the real takeaway from this. And these 3 laws that he came up with are they're almost like almost like Buddhist sutras or something, where like you have this like mental focusing, device to help you focus on going on with being creative in various contexts. So that's what I would say. Do you have anything you want to end with here, Florian, or are you good?
Yeah, I think no, I think you said it perfectly.
All right. Well, thank you, Florian. Again, it's always a pleasure having you on.
Thanks for having me.
This is Todd Lewis of the Prejudice podcast, signing off.